Mark Stevens, the CEO of a major airline, had always prided himself on leading from the front, but lately, he had begun to feel disconnected from the reality of the daily operations at his company. Despite the constant flow of reports and the assurances from his management team, he knew that something wasn't quite right. Complaints about long delays, disorganized check-ins, and unfriendly flight attendants were starting to become a regular fixture in customer reviews, and the more he heard, the more he realized he had no true sense of what his employees and passengers were actually experiencing. He decided to go undercover, slipping into the anonymity of a regular passenger to experience it all firsthand. With a sense of both excitement and anxiety, Mark dressed casually, blending in with the crowd, and boarded a flight that was scheduled to fly across the country. His plan was simple: sit back, relax, and observe. He didn't want to make any waves or stand out in any way, just a quiet, unassuming traveler observing the environment that he oversaw. As he walked down the aisle, searching for his seat, he glanced at the numbers, expecting to find his row. But to his surprise, someone was already sitting in his seat, an elderly woman who looked up at him with a polite smile, seemingly unaware of the mix-up. Mark paused, his mind racing. Surely, this must be a simple mistake, a common mix-up in seat assignments. But as he politely pointed out that she was in his seat, the woman raised her eyebrows and said, "Well, I was told this seat was mine." He glanced around, perplexed, and tried to explain that the seat was reserved for him. He began to feel a wave of frustration, but kept it in check, aware that he had to stay calm. After a brief conversation with the flight attendant, it turned out that the airline had overbooked the flight. The woman had been assigned his seat due to a last-minute change in seating arrangements, and there was no clear solution other than to offer him another seat in a less-than-ideal spot near the back of the plane. Mark agreed, though reluctantly, and moved to the new seat, trying to mask the growing sense of discomfort in his chest. The experience, while minor, left him unsettled, but he reminded himself that this wasn't about perfection, it was about seeing the challenges his employees faced. But as the flight went on, the surprises didn't stop there. The flight attendants, although friendly enough, were rushed, their movements hurried as they served passengers, and the sense of chaos in the cabin was palpable. Mark couldn't help but notice how tense the atmosphere was. The flight crew was visibly exhausted, hardly taking a moment to breathe between serving drinks, answering questions, and dealing with the growing frustration of the passengers. He saw one of the attendants, Jenna, a young woman who seemed to be carrying a heavy load, stumble while navigating the narrow aisle, bumping into a passenger's elbow. She quickly apologized, but her expression was one of sheer exhaustion. Mark's heart ached for her. She wasn't just serving drinks, she was running a race, trying to keep up with demands that were beyond her control. As the flight progressed, Mark's observations continued to deepen his concern. A few rows in front of him, an argument broke out between two passengers over the overhead compartment. One of the passengers, clearly agitated, began raising his voice, demanding that the flight attendants do something about the situation. Mark watched as Jenna and her colleague, trying to defuse the situation, became increasingly stressed. The passengers around them seemed to feed off the tension, the overall atmosphere turning more hostile. The flight attendants, caught in the middle, struggled to regain control. Mark could see it in their eyes, the fatigue, the frustration, and the pressure to meet the demands of every single passenger. At that moment, Mark realized just how hard his employees were working to keep everything running smoothly under immense pressure. The idea of a perfect flight was a myth, and the cracks in his company's operations were much more visible than he had anticipated. The stress wasn't just about the logistics, it was about the emotional toll that this job took on everyone involved. It was a relentless cycle of service, response, and reaction, with little room for error and even less room for respite. Mark looked around the cabin, observing the tired faces of the crew and the growing unease in the passengers. It wasn't just the overbooked flight or the long hours, it was the accumulation of countless small issues that had built up over time. He had built this company on the premise of excellence, but as he sat there, he realized that excellence wasn't just about operational efficiency, it was about ensuring that his people had the support, the tools, and the space to do their jobs without breaking down. The flight finally touched down, and Mark disembarked, his mind swirling with thoughts. The experience had given him more insight than he could have imagined, but it had also shown him how much work was needed to truly support his employees. It wasn't enough to simply improve customer satisfaction metrics or optimize flight schedules, he needed to focus on the well-being of the people who made it all possible. Mark knew that the changes wouldn't be easy, but they had to start somewhere. His perspective had shifted forever, and as he walked off the plane, he made a vow to ensure that his company would not just be known for its efficiency, but for how it treated its people. This was the beginning of a new journey, one that would redefine leadership and what it meant to run an airline that truly cared for its employees, not just its bottom line. Mark had been traveling all day, his patience wearing thin as the hours stretched on in the cramped, uncomfortable airport terminal. After a rushed check-in and a quick snack, he finally made his way to the gate, eager to board the flight that would take him home. His body ached, and all he wanted was to sink into his assigned seat, close his eyes, and relax for the duration of the flight. He'd been looking forward to this moment for hours, but when he arrived at his seat, the aisle was blocked by a woman who was sitting comfortably in the very spot he had reserved. She didn't seem to be in any kind of distress or discomfort, and her serene, almost casual demeanor only made the situation more confusing. She was seated back in the chair with a kind of calm confidence, her eyes fixed on the screen of her phone. Mark stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Surely, she knew she was in the wrong seat. It wasn't a difficult concept to grasp, everyone knew their seats by the time they approached the plane. But as he stood there, watching her swipe through her phone, his confusion slowly turned into frustration. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and finally spoke. "Excuse me," Mark said, his voice polite at first, though the edge of irritation was beginning to creep in. "This is my seat. Could you please move?" The woman didn't immediately respond. Instead, she glanced up at him with a quick, uninterested look, as if he were just another person asking something insignificant. Without so much as a word, she returned her gaze to her phone. The indifference in her actions took Mark by surprise, and his patience began to erode. Was she unaware of her mistake, or was she simply refusing to acknowledge it? He tried again, his voice a little more forceful now, but still controlled. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat." "Here," he said, holding up his boarding pass and pointing to the seat number. "You're in my assigned spot." The woman glanced at the boarding pass for only a split second, then looked back at him, as if she had already decided that his claim didn't matter. "Oh," she said flatly, barely looking at him. Her voice carried a slight dismissive tone, as though this was just another small, inconsequential inconvenience in her day. She didn't even seem bothered by the fact that she was sitting in someone else's seat, and it was as if Mark's request was a minor blip in the grand scheme of her travel experience. "I'm not moving," she added with a casual shrug, as though it were no big deal. Mark's frustration flared. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This woman's complete disregard for the situation, For his right to sit where he had been assigned, felt like an affront to his own personal space, his own time. He had followed the rules, done everything right, and now here she was, acting like it was beneath her to comply with a simple request. It wasn't the kind of situation Mark was used to. He was a man who prided himself on his calm demeanor and respect for others. But the blatant disrespect in this moment made him feel invisible, as if his needs and requests didn't matter at all. For a second, he considered walking away, finding a flight attendant to handle the situation. But something inside him, some sense of justice or fairness, made him press on. This was his seat, and he wasn't going to let it be taken from him so easily. "Listen," he said, trying to remain composed, though his patience was wearing thin. "I understand if you didn't notice, but this is my seat. You can sit somewhere else, but I need you to move." At this, the woman sighed audibly, as though his persistence was a nuisance. She finally set her phone down and raised her eyes to meet his. There was no apology in her gaze, no hint of recognition that she had done something wrong. Instead, she just shrugged again, as though the entire issue were a minor inconvenience that she couldn't be bothered with. "I'm not moving," she repeated, this time with a more firm tone, as if to solidify her stance. Mark felt his heart rate pick up, the sense of frustration now mingled with a burning sense of indignation. How could someone be so dismissive? How could they not see that this wasn't just a trivial matter for him? This was about respect, about mutual understanding, and this woman had no intention of giving him either. Mark's emotions swirled within him, but there was one thing he knew for sure: he wasn't going to back down. "I'll have to call a flight attendant," he said, his voice now firm with resolve. The woman looked at him, her expression still unreadable, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible sigh of exasperation. She stood up with an exaggerated slowness, taking her time to gather her things and muttering something under her breath. "Fine," she said, "but I hope you're happy." As she moved away from the seat, Mark felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. The seat was finally his, but it felt hollow, stripped of any satisfaction he had hoped for in this small victory. He sat down, still feeling the sting of the encounter of someone who had chosen to disrespect his rights and make him fight for what he was entitled to. As the woman walked away, Mark couldn't help but think that it wasn't just the seat she had taken, it was the quiet, unspoken belief that she was somehow above the rules, and that the world should bend to accommodate her whims. It wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about the way she had made him feel, insignificant, as if his needs didn't matter. And for a moment, he wondered if this was just one small example of the larger disregard people often had for each other in a world where personal boundaries seemed to vanish with every passing day. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, watching as the woman in front of him finally stood up, her movements deliberate but detached, as though she were performing a chore rather than responding to the discomfort of the moment. The small space between their seats in the cramped cabin felt even smaller now, the air thick with unspoken tension. He had been waiting patiently for her to move, but her lack of apology, her unbothered demeanor, ignited something in him. He had tried to brush it off at first, thinking it was just a small inconvenience, nothing worth dwelling on. But now, as he watched her rise with barely a glance in his direction, her indifference felt like a personal slight. The frustration that had simmered beneath the surface began to bubble up, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a momentary lapse in civility. It was a reflection of something deeper, something wrong with the whole system, the culture of the airline itself. Mark had been flying with this airline for years, always satisfied with the service, but today felt different. The uncomfortable experience on this cramped flight, the woman's failure to acknowledge his presence or the awkwardness of the situation, seemed to open a door to a larger issue he hadn't wanted to see. It wasn't just about this interaction, it was about the countless other moments that had passed without apology or recognition, the small things that added up over time, slowly eroding the overall customer experience. As he moved to step past her, the irritation in his chest seemed to grow, spreading like wildfire. She hadn't even looked at him when she stepped aside. It was as though he were invisible. He hadn't expected her to apologize for the awkwardness, but a simple acknowledgement would have made the moment feel less like an inconvenience, less like he was an afterthought. Instead, he felt disrespected, as if his presence didn't matter. The more he thought about it, the more his irritation transformed into something deeper. Mark's mind started to race. Was this how the airline treated all of its passengers? Was this how they treated the people who paid for their services? He glanced around the cabin, noticing the tension in the air. Other passengers were eyeing the situation with a mix of discomfort and curiosity, sensing the escalation, feeling the growing unease. No one was speaking, but the silence between them seemed to say everything. Mark's hands clenched at his sides, and for a moment, he considered walking away, letting it go. But something inside him snapped. If he let this pass, if he ignored it, it would be just another small crack in the foundation of customer service, just another example of poor training or lack of attention. He couldn't stand the thought of letting this one small mistake slide, not when it felt like it was part of something much bigger. This wasn't just about the woman in the seat. This was about the culture of the airline, the way they treated passengers, the lack of care, the lack of accountability. And Mark realized, in that moment, that this small lapse was just the tip of the iceberg. The airline, in his mind, was slipping into mediocrity. He was no longer willing to be a passive participant in that decline. As he stood in the narrow aisle, waiting for her to sit back down, he took a deep breath, preparing himself for what he knew would be an uncomfortable confrontation. He had to say something, anything, to make sure this wasn't just another unnoticed mistake. "Excuse me," Mark said, his voice a little sharper than he intended. The woman looked up at him, startled, as if she hadn't realized he was still standing there. "I don't know if you noticed, but there's no need to make things so awkward," he continued, his words coming faster now. "A simple excuse me or acknowledgement would have made a difference. It's not just about this moment, it's about respect. It's about how we treat each other, you know." The woman blinked at him, her face a mixture of confusion and defensiveness. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Mark could see the defensive walls rise in her eyes, the discomfort in her posture. The atmosphere around them seemed to thicken, like everyone on the plane had become aware of the growing conflict. People around them were looking at one another, exchanging quiet glances, sensing the escalating tension. Mark could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his body tight with the adrenaline of confrontation. But he knew he couldn't back down now. If he let it slide, he would be complicit in the very indifference he had come to despise. The woman finally muttered something under her breath, but Mark barely heard it over the pounding in his ears. He had made his point. He wasn't going to be invisible anymore. And as he turned to head back to his seat, he realized that this was more than just a confrontation with a fellow passenger. It was about standing up for the kind of environment he wanted to exist in, the kind of respect he wanted to feel, whether on a plane, in a store, or anywhere else. The tension between them didn't evaporate immediately, but something in Mark had shifted. He wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. The tension in the airplane cabin was thick, as if the air itself had become charged with the unspoken conflict between Sophia, the flight attendant, and the irate passenger she was attempting to manage. Mark had been sitting quietly in his seat, watching as the situation unfolded with a growing sense of discomfort. At first, it had seemed like a minor disagreement, a misunderstanding, perhaps, but as the seconds ticked by, the escalation became unmistakable. Sophia, visibly flustered, was struggling to maintain her composure in the face of the passenger's increasingly belligerent demands. The man's voice had risen, his words sharp with entitlement, and the surrounding passengers, though silently observing, had begun to whisper among themselves, their eyes flicking nervously between the confrontation and one another. Mark could feel the unease settling over the cabin, but what truly struck him was how out of control the exchange had become, not just because of the passenger's rudeness, but because of the way Sophia was handling it. She was overwhelmed. Her body language was defensive, her eyes flickering back and forth as she tried to keep her tone calm, but the words she spoke were becoming increasingly strained. It was clear that, despite her professionalism, she was losing ground in a situation that was spiraling fast. For a moment, Mark had considered letting the flight crew handle it, as he had no desire to disrupt the flow of the flight. But then something clicked. He realized that the situation wasn't just about a passenger and a flight attendant, it was indicative of a broader issue that had been festering within the company for some time: a lack of respect, a breakdown in communication, and an unhealthy environment that could no longer be ignored. Mark knew that if the problem wasn't addressed, it would only continue to grow, eroding the very core of what the airline stood for. It wasn't just about the passengers' demands, nor was it solely about Sophia's struggle to maintain control. It was about the systemic issues within the company that had led to this very moment, the pressure on employees, the lack of support, and the breakdown in morale that was affecting not just the flight attendants, but the passengers, too. His thoughts became clear, and with a deep breath, Mark knew he could no longer sit by. He had to act. Slowly, he rose from his seat, his movements deliberate, his eyes never leaving the scene before him. He could feel the tension in the cabin shift as he moved forward, the passengers' gazes turning toward him, some of them recognizing him and some not. But Sophia, still caught in the heat of the moment, didn't notice him until he was almost beside her. When she finally did look up, the shock on her face was instantaneous. She froze, eyes wide, as she saw Mark standing there, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around him. The passenger's tirade faltered, confusion rippling through him as he noticed the sudden change in atmosphere. Mark's voice was calm, but carried an authority that instantly cut through the noise of the confrontation. "Excuse me," he said, his tone steady but firm, drawing the attention of everyone in the cabin. "I'm Mark, the CEO of this airline." The words landed like a bombshell. The room fell silent. Sophia's face drained of color, and the passenger blinked in disbelief. Mark had said it so simply, as though it was just another day for him, but the impact was immediate. In that moment, the entire dynamic shifted. Sophia, still in shock, took a small step back, almost as if she needed to distance herself from the realization. The passenger's frustration hung in the air, but it was now overshadowed by the recognition of who stood before them. Mark took a moment, letting the silence settle before continuing, his voice soft but resolute. "I've been watching this situation unfold," he said, his gaze flicking between the two of them. "And I understand that there's been a misunderstanding here. But the way this situation is being handled, the way we're treating each other, it's unacceptable. It's a reflection of much deeper issues, not just here, but across the entire airline." Sophia opened her mouth, perhaps to apologize or explain herself, but Mark held up a hand, his expression not one of anger, but of calm authority. This isn't just about a single seat, or a single flight. It's about how we operate as a company. How we treat our employees, how we treat our passengers, and how we resolve conflict. Right now, this situation is a reflection of that breakdown. His voice remained calm, but there was an undeniable weight to his words. I'm not angry. But I am disappointed. This isn't the kind of experience we want to provide to our customers, and it's certainly not the kind of environment we want to foster for our team. He took a deep breath and turned to the passenger. Sir, I understand you're frustrated, but I ask that you please take a step back and allow us to resolve this in a way that respects everyone involved. I'll personally make sure your concerns are addressed when we land. Mark's gaze softened as he looked at Sophia. She had lowered her head slightly, her body language still defensive but slowly beginning to relax under his steady gaze. Sophia, Mark continued, his tone gentler, I know you're under pressure. I know this job isn't easy. But I want you to understand that the way you handle situations like this shapes not just the passenger's experience, but also the culture we're trying to create here. He paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to sink in. You're a part of this team, and I'm here to help you succeed. But change is necessary, for all of us. And we can't change unless we start by acknowledging where we've fallen short. There was a pause as the words settled, and the tension in the cabin slowly began to dissipate. The passengers, who had been watching with bated breath, seemed to exhale collectively. The air had cleared, not with anger or confrontation, but with a sense of clarity. Mark had not escalated the situation. He had not raised his voice or pointed fingers. He had simply revealed the truth. The airline was his responsibility, and its problems, though rooted in the actions of individuals, were a reflection of larger, systemic issues. As the cabin began to settle back into a quiet hum, Mark turned and addressed the entire room. I will be making changes to ensure that this kind of behavior doesn't happen again, he said, his voice still calm but filled with the conviction of someone who knew that the hard work was just beginning. But I need each and every one of you to understand change starts with us. And in that moment, Sophia knew, as the realization of the situation truly sunk in, that this wasn't just about a confrontation with a single passenger. It was about something much bigger, and Mark had just set the wheels of change in motion. Sophia stood motionless, her eyes wide with disbelief as Mark's words echoed in her ears. The CEO of the airline, the very person she had been unknowingly disrespecting and speaking ill of, was standing right in front of her. Her heart raced, her cheeks flushed with the sting of sudden realization, and the weight of the past few minutes came crashing down on her. The sharp words she had muttered earlier, the complaints she had voiced about the company, about Mark himself, suddenly felt like daggers, as though they were cutting into her very soul. How could she have been so unaware? How could she have so carelessly disrespected the person who held the power to shape the future of the airline and its employees? Her thoughts spun out of control, guilt flooding her veins as she looked at Mark, unsure of how to react or what to say. The silence between them felt deafening, suffocating, but then Mark spoke again, his tone calm, almost reassuring. Sophia, he said, his voice steady but kind, this is not about shame. This is a moment to learn and to grow. I understand that frustrations can build up, and sometimes we don't always express them in the best way. But what matters now is what we can do with that frustration. He paused, allowing her a moment to process his words. I want to hear from you. I want to understand what your experience is like here at the airline. What's it really like to work for us? What can we do to make things better? His words were unexpected, and they struck her in a way she couldn't quite put into words. Here was the CEO of the entire company, a man she had thought to be distant, perhaps even out of touch with the struggles of his employees, asking her for feedback. He wasn't angry, he wasn't reprimanding her. Instead, he was offering an opportunity for dialogue, for connection, and for change. Sophia felt a strange mixture of surprise and relief. She had expected to be met with anger, perhaps even a dismissal of her concerns as petty complaints, but instead, Mark had invited her to speak freely, to share her truth. It was an offer of respect she hadn't anticipated, and it made her realize just how little she had truly understood about the culture of the airline until now. Her mind, which had been racing just moments before, now slowed down. She could feel her body relax just slightly, her shoulders no longer tense with fear. This wasn't a moment of punishment, but a moment of reflection and opportunity to speak up. For the first time in a long while, she felt heard. She took a shaky breath, unsure of how to begin, but then the words started to flow. She started, her voice faltering before gaining strength. I've been with the airline for a while now, and it's been hard. We're always expected to do more, to push harder, without ever feeling like we're supported. There's always pressure to meet numbers, to maintain this perfect image, but no one ever really checks in on us. We don't have the tools or the training we need to handle everything, and it feels like no one listens when we try to bring up problems. It's like we're just cogs in a machine, you know? The customers come first, and we're left to pick up the pieces. She looked up at Mark, her eyes now full of emotion, but she didn't look away. She needed him to understand. There's no room for mistakes, and when they happen, it feels like the whole world is falling apart. And we're all just expected to smile through it, to pretend that everything is okay, even when we're drowning. Mark listened without interrupting, his expression soft but attentive. Sophia's words, though raw and unfiltered, seemed to reach him in a way that she hadn't expected. She had spent so long holding in these frustrations, letting them fester quietly beneath the surface, and now, with Mark's patient listening, she could feel them unraveling, each word a release of the pressure she had been carrying. For the first time, it felt like her voice mattered. When she finished speaking, she felt exhausted but also strangely lighter, as though the weight of her unspoken feelings had finally been lifted. Mark looked at her, his expression thoughtful, and then he nodded slowly. "Thank you for sharing that with me, Sophia," he said, his voice sincere. "I hear you, and I understand. No one should have to feel like they're invisible or unimportant. I'm truly sorry that you felt that way." He paused, taking a breath before continuing. "This isn't the kind of environment we want to create, and I know we have a lot of work to do. But your honesty today is exactly what we need to move forward. I can't promise that change will happen overnight, but I will personally make sure that we start addressing these issues. We will listen to our employees. We will make sure you have the support you need to succeed and thrive here, not just survive." Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she processed his words. She had expected some form of dismissal, maybe even an excuse for the company's shortcomings, but instead, Mark was offering a genuine commitment to change, to listening, and to improving the workplace for everyone. The sense of embarrassment she had felt just moments ago began to fade, replaced by something else: hope. Hope that things could be better. Hope that her voice, and the voices of others who had felt unheard, might finally be listened to. She looked at Mark, the CEO, no longer as a distant figure but as someone who was willing to take responsibility and make a difference. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. Mark smiled, a genuine, reassuring smile. "Thank you, Sophia, for being brave enough to speak up. This is just the beginning, and I'm glad we're doing it together." As she walked away from the conversation, Sophia couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. The weight of frustration that had been crushing her for so long was beginning to lift, and in its place was a new sense of purpose, a belief that change was not only possible but within reach. Mark sat across from Sophia, his fingers nervously tapping on the coffee cup in front of him. The weight of his position as an executive in the airline company had been dragging on him more than usual lately. Decisions made in boardrooms seemed to have little connection to the reality faced by the employees on the front lines, and Mark was starting to feel the disconnect more acutely. He had been so focused on big-picture strategies, customer satisfaction metrics, revenue goals, market expansion that he hadn't truly considered the toll these decisions were taking on the people who made them happen. Across from him, Sophia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her tired eyes betraying the exhaustion she had been carrying for months. As a customer service agent, she had long been the face of the company, often the first point of contact for frustrated, irate customers. Day after day, she dealt with complaints, handling each one with a smile, masking the growing frustration within her. The constant lack of communication from management, the feeling of being undervalued, and the sense that her voice didn't matter had worn her down to a point where she questioned whether the job was even worth it anymore. Despite the disparity in their roles, the two of them had never really connected on a deeper level before, their worlds so different that any understanding seemed almost impossible. But today, as they found themselves in the same room, there was a quiet tension that felt different, an openness that neither of them could ignore. Mark was the first to break the silence, his voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about what's happening with customer service lately. The numbers aren't where we want them to be, and I'm hearing more and more about customer complaints, but what I don't hear enough of is what's happening with you all, the people on the ground. We've been so focused on the numbers that I'm starting to wonder if we've lost sight of the bigger picture." Sophia met his gaze, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. She hadn't expected this kind of admission from someone in his position, especially given the divide between the executives and the front-line staff. "It's been tough," she began, her voice tinged with frustration but laced with the honesty she had kept buried for so long. "Every day, it feels like we're being asked to perform miracles with no support. I'm answering calls all day, trying to calm down customers who are angry about delays, about cancellations, and then I have to take all that frustration and bottle it up because there's no one to talk to about how it's affecting me or my colleagues. It's exhausting. And on top of that, the communication from management is, well, let's just say it's non-existent." Mark shifted uncomfortably, feeling the sting of her words. He had heard similar complaints before, but hearing them from Sophia, someone who had lived this reality every day, hit harder than he expected. "I can't imagine how tough that must be," he admitted. "But I'm starting to realize something. We're so focused on metrics, on making the numbers work, that we've lost touch with the people who are actually doing the work. The people who are dealing with the customers face to face, handling the situations we're only hearing about in reports." Sophia nodded, the corners of her lips tugging into a bitter half-smile. "Yeah, and that's the problem. It feels like we're just cogs in a machine, you know? No matter how much effort we put in, it doesn't seem to make a difference in the long run. The company is making decisions without considering the impact on the people who are actually dealing with the fallout. And honestly, It's hard to stay motivated when it feels like no one's listening to us. Mark sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the conversation. He had known there were issues within the company, but hearing them laid bare by Sophia, in such a raw and direct way, forced him to confront just how deep those issues ran. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been so focused on trying to improve customer satisfaction from a top-down perspective that I didn't consider how disconnected we had become from the reality on the ground. I've been making decisions that impact the day-to-day operations without truly understanding the challenges you face. It's like we've been building this system without thinking about the people who actually have to work within it." Sophia looked at him, her eyes softening. "It's not just the decisions, Mark. It's the lack of communication. We get new policies, new guidelines, and then we're expected to make them work without ever knowing the reasoning behind them. It feels like we're in the dark all the time. And that lack of transparency makes it harder for us to do our jobs well, because we're never sure what's expected of us, or why we're doing things a certain way." Mark listened intently, feeling a sense of guilt and realization settle in his chest. He had been so focused on efficiency, on the broader goals, that he had failed to recognize how important it was to make sure everyone, from the top to the bottom, felt heard and understood. "I hear you," he said after a moment of silence. "And I want to do better. I need to do better. We need to find a way to bridge this gap between the decisions we're making and the realities you're facing every day. We can't keep operating in silos, and we can't keep ignoring the struggles of the people who are doing the work." The conversation shifted then, moving toward solutions. Mark asked questions about how he could improve communication, how he could make the managers more approachable, and how he could ensure that employees at every level felt like their voices mattered. Sophia, for the first time in a long time, felt like she was being heard. As they continued to talk, she realized that Mark's willingness to listen wasn't just a formality, it was a genuine desire to understand the disconnect and make real changes. By the end of their conversation, the two of them had uncovered the parallel struggles they had both faced, despite their vastly different roles. Mark's realization was a pivotal moment for him. He understood now that the key to improving customer satisfaction and employee morale wasn't about numbers or systems, it was about human connection. It was about listening, understanding, and fostering an environment where every employee, regardless of their role, felt seen and supported. And for Sophia, the conversation marked a turning point as well. She no longer felt like an anonymous voice in a sea of complaints. For the first time, she felt like her frustrations were acknowledged and that change might actually be on the horizon. The conversation wasn't a quick fix, but it was the beginning of something important, a moment of understanding that could lead to a better future for both the company and the people who made it all possible. Mark stood before the company, his gaze sweeping across the room filled with employees, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all waiting for him to follow through on his promise. The weight of his words from earlier hung in the air, a mix of responsibility and remorse. He had seen firsthand the consequences of ignoring employee feedback, the frustration that festered in the silence, the resentment that built up over time. The tipping point had been the encounter with Sophia, a moment that exposed just how deeply the disconnect between upper management and staff had grown. Sophia had, with quiet courage, brought to light the concerns that so many had been harboring in secret, and Mark knew that the time for change had come. The company could no longer function